Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Castor, and I'm the Chief Business Development Officer for Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer. And I want to extend a thanks to all of the registrants and participants who have joined us for today's webinar about things that you need to know to make a successful transition in reopening your business. We still got a few people that are registering and joining the call. We had a great response for today's webinar, but in the interest of everybody's time, I want to kick this thing off and get it going. So again, thanks to all of you for joining us. I'd like to introduce Lindsay Ford, the Membership and Development Manager for the Park City Chamber of Commerce and Convention and Visitors Bureau. Lindsay?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you just fine.
Awesome. Just want to say thank you to Jason and his team for hosting this today. It's going to be jam-packed full of really great information for you guys. I believe we are recording session, so we will be posting this after to all of the attendees, as well as their contact information should you have any questions for any of them following the session. So I hope everybody enjoys.
Great. Thanks a lot, Lindsay, and thanks for partnering with us on today's webinar. So we recognize that this is a very difficult and challenging time for all of you. As employers, there's a lot of complicated issues that one must deal with to successfully reopen your business. Today, the purpose of today's webinar is really to provide you with practical guidance with respect to legal implications associated with opening your business and going through this transition. We've got, as Lindsay mentioned, a jam-packed agenda, a lot of information that we intend to share with you today. So I'll move to our next slide and just quickly touch base on the format of the webinar. As you all know, the lines are muted today. We will be accepting Q&A through the chat feature. If you would like to send chat or your questions via the chat to me, we'll try and address those throughout the presentation today. As Lindsay mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and all of the slides, along with a link to the recording, will be shared with you after. It wouldn't be right if we didn't start this presentation off without a legal disclaimer. So here we go. Today's presentation should be considered a source of general information and should not be considered as legal advice. If you have any questions about how this information relates to your business, you must consult with your legal counsel. And now that we've got through the formalities, I'm going to turn the time over to my colleague, Mark Wagner. And just so you all know, joining me today, in addition to Mark, is Christina Jepson and Susan Mott-Schiedler. Mark, I'm going to turn the time over to you to give a brief introduction.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate it. So today, the topic at hand, of course, is the process of reopening businesses. As we've all seen, various states and various businesses are in the process of reopening. Others are starting to consider what that's going to look like for them. And there are, of course, a number of considerations and potential issues about what this is all going to look like, whether you're literally reopening from the closed operations or whether you're transitioning back to closer to what operations looked like before. We've spent quite a bit of time in our team looking at various legal considerations as well as practical considerations on both the federal and the state, and then also down to some extent to the local levels, to the extent they speak to the issues. And we've assembled some information that we hope is going to be valuable to you as something that you start considering, and things to both look for affirmatively and things to try to avoid. Basically what we'll do is, well, in fact, I'll mention also just briefly before I'm going to give you a quick summary or just kind of table of contents, so to speak, of what we're going to talk about here. But and some of you may be aware that Utah legislature recently passed a statute that itself purports to limit liability for businesses related to COVID-19 exposures of individuals on a premises. It it has some limitations or some carve-outs in it where immunity doesn't apply to willful misconduct, reckless infliction of harm, or intentional infliction of harm, all phrases which, of course, will need to be fleshed out if and when litigation comes, more likely the when litigation comes. But one important note on that statute is, while it is certainly helpful to have for business owners to have, there is some possibility of it could be potentially declared invalid under the Open Courts Clause provision of the Utah Constitution. That's something that even the legislators discussing the statute acknowledged during the debate. Probably best to not pin your hopes on that, but do what you need to do to act reasonably under the circumstances. And to that end, we're going to start off with my partner, Susan Scheisler, as she's going to be talking about creating a plan to guide you in reopening your businesses and addressing the many concerns that will be presented. And I'll talk then very briefly about some sources of relevant guidance, both general and industry specific. Then my partner, Christina Jepson, is going to provide some fairly helpful information about screening employees for COVID-19, including options and steps to take depending on the outcome of the screening. And then she's going to jump into a quick discussion about steps employers can take to help protect vulnerable persons. After that, I'll jump back in with some considerations involving personal protective equipment, primarily masks, and then also discuss some considerations for testing, isolating individuals, and doing contact tracing. Finally, at the end, if we have some time, and that's going to be an open question, we'll try to save a little bit of time for Q&A, but we found that there's just so much information packed in, we might have to follow up some of that post-presentation, depending on what people's needs are. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jason, and to Susan.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the great introduction. Susan, it's all yours.
Thanks, Mark and Jason. So you can move to the next slide. To follow up on Mark's considerations on liability, so you want to make sure that you're not liable for creating an unsafe work environment, and you want to make sure people are safe. So part of that is creating an opening plan to see what is opening going to look like in this new COVID-19 environment. There are a few overarching considerations to consider before you dive into, calling people back to work, opening your workplace. You want to consider how you're going to communicate this to people, both who you're going to communicate it to in terms of your employees, your customers, vendors, when you're going to do it, and then the types of communication. You want to start communicating now with your employees about what your plans are, and probably your customers too. Appoint a COVID-19 workplace coordinator, step number 2, and that person is going to deal with leave policies, is going to be in charge of communicating with employees on the nuts and bolts of this, in conjunction with your C-suite, your execs, your head honchos. You want to consider there the tone from the top, and make sure that everyone is on board with this. So if you require people to wear masks, for example, you want to make sure that everyone, top to bottom, is wearing a mask as they're supposed to. Then you want to consider the type of documentation that you're going to need to implement this. You want to assign any new documentation requirements to specific individuals so that it gets done. And part of this is, as you know, lawyers like to see documents. They like to see proof in time that something happened. So you want to make sure that you can establish that you were creating a safe workplace and paying attention to all the rules as they were happening. The next slide, you want to look at is, or think about, is you're going to be addressing, your plan is going to address the 3 Ps. So your physical spaces, your people, and your policies. And the last thing you want to consider before you jump in is all of the resources that are available to you and the guidelines and the rules on a state and local level. And you might also be in an industry that has come up with some industry or trade guidance to help you open up that has very helpful hints about spacing and that sort of thing. So step one, identify what you need to do with your physical space. You're going to walk through your space and look for cleaning and spacing problems. I suggest walking from considering how employees get to your building, how customers get to your building, and how they come in, how they get to the office, how they get to your business. Identify high traffic and congregation areas. Are there elevators, time clocks, bathrooms, that sort of thing, where people are going to be waiting in line, congregating, and not going to be able to establish the 6-foot spacing. And then you want to identify other spacing concerns. So if you're in an office environment, cubicles, desks, do you need to move those away so that people working at stations can have 6 foot? Do you need to put barriers in? Do you need to make sure that different people are working at different times? That sort of thing. Creating and just walk through your space and figure out where those pressure points are. Next space. And then create a protocol to address the space issues. So you can stagger schedules, for example, so that people aren't all lining up at the time clock or at the elevator at the same time. You can create shifts where people come in really early or later than normal. You can still have people work from home as needed. You can create physical barriers, so the glass that we see in grocery stores and banks now. You can create a one person at a time or spacing rules. You put tape on the floor 6 feet apart in lines and that sort of thing. You might need additional equipment, so tape, cordoning, that sort of thing. You might consider removing items from your workplace so that you don't have to clean them. Unused furniture, for example, desks, knickknacks on people's desks, that sort of thing. Now would be the time to depersonalize the workspace a little bit. You want to, after you've done this, establish cleaning protocols on how you're going to establish what it takes to keep a clean work environment. Are you going to hire people? Are you going to have people clean their own spaces? Are you going to have people, say, clean the copier after every time that they use it? You're going to want to make sure that you have a place for your safety items and a place to throw your safety items away adequately. You don't want overflowing trash cans from the new mask requirement or glove requirement, for example. Now is the time, if you've been planning on it, to get rid of open grazing and buffets and candy bowls and sort of the nemesis of the office, and everyone likes them, time to get rid of them. And finally, you want to consult with the landlord regarding your common spaces, and communicate your plan, what you're going to do, and see what they're going to do. Are they following what they need to do? And if you're the landlord, also communicate with your tenants. The second P is people. So how are you going to move people and have people work in your space, have customers in your space, vendors in your space? When are you going to have people come back? Are you going to allow some employees, some vendors, but not all? Are you going to have a waiting period? The government, the Utah state government has suggested that if you can still keep people home, teleworking to do that. But you can have, for example, volunteer groups come back, business groups, stagger them based on job duties. You want to be careful here about discrimination concerns. So don't bring back, for example, all men because you think that they need to support their family and their wives are at home, that sort of thing. Documentation is important here to document why you brought certain groups back. So it may be that a group you need back is primarily composed of individuals not in a protected class, so men, for example. And the people that a non-essential group for you are all women. And you just want to establish those business needs and concerns in real time so that if there's ever a question, you can establish what your motivations were. Then you want to apply this also to vendors and customers in terms of staggering maybe when they come back in. Decide when. That could be job duty functions, as we've discussed. Guidance from authorities. So you're going to be able to bring back more people later, you might have to dial it back a little bit as well. And then installation of safety measures, or even being able to have adequate masks, for example, for your employees, might also affect when you can. Next slide. So staggered schedules is a good way to potentially deal with spacing concerns and health concerns. Different hours, days, arrival times, partial remote work, so people come in on a certain day and stay home on others. You can have volunteers come in, and then if you know that you have individuals with health conditions, you might want to consider how to deal with that with them in the workplace and create potentially safe places for them to work. You need to decide what you're going to require your employees to do as well. Are you going to require testing to come back to work? Christina will talk a little bit about that. Notification of exposure. What kind of safety gear are you going to require? Are you going to allow people to bring in their own masks? And what is that going to look like? Does any mask go? Can people wear a bandana? That sort of thing. Like, what sort of rules are you going to establish? And then finally, you need to make sure that everyone understands physical distance, so 6 feet. There are apps that you can have people install on their phone that warn each other when they're within 6 feet of another employee. Those are good in types of environments where people aren't always mindful of what they're doing, or they're very used to moving quickly. For offices, it's probably easier to maintain. And then finally, you want to create your policies and protocols to implement all of this. Obviously, there are new protocols for cleaning. You also want a policy for what you're going to do when somebody tests positive. I don't think it's a question of if. I'm pretty sure it's a when. And you want to understand so you can move fluidly through that process. We're going to talk a little bit about that further today as well. And then you want policies for tracking your employees, like who is in the building when. And this isn't a wage and hour concern, but it's going to make it easier when you have somebody who tests positive to determine who else was exposed without having to send out a huge blast of, hey, we had positive in our business. And then finally, you want to go through and create any additional policies you need, like COVID-19 pay policies, and make sure that they're coordinated with your existing policies. Do you have sick policies that need to be changed? Are you going to loosen up your leave policies while employees still have childcare and schooling duties? Are your emergency backup plans up to date? And then finally, make sure that all of your employee contacts are to date, so when you need to communicate with them, to say positive or changes in the work plan, opening plan, you have the right contact. Next slide. A very communication and training. People need to hear things a lot before they know it, and can move through a very familiar workspace with new rules in mind. And so you want to communicate this to your employees as well as your vendors, customers, and your landlord. To communicate with employees, it's important that you have frequent and regular training. And those of you who are in the construction industry probably have safety huddles every day, or restaurants, for example, have pre-shift meetings. You need to have one every day for a time period when you first open up, so that you can discuss the new safety measures, problems people are having, how to implement them, that sort of thing. And you need to make sure that you document who was there and what was discussed. So again, you can establish in real time that you were not being reckless, you were paying attention to all the rules, and you required all of the employees to come and learn about these. And then you also want to have consistent discipline of non-compliant employees. So if you require masks, make sure that you discipline people across the board, top to bottom, for not wearing them, for example, the same. And then finally, that's my final slide. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you, Mark.
Hey, Susan, before we transition over to Mark, a couple of questions have come in concerning plan templates. And do plan templates exist? And what would you advise on that?
Yes, so we do have some plan templates and available if you reach out, primarily because it's not one size fits all. It is a list of considerations that you can move through, and we can work with you on that to determine what needs to be in your particular plan.
Thanks, Susan.
Thanks.
Mark, we'll pass the baton to you.
Thank you, Mark.
Great, thank you, Jason and Susan. Just briefly, as Susan touched on, in establishing your plan, you're going to want to follow, at least consider relevant guidance, and there are a lot of sources for those. There's, it's kind of a combination of both lots of information, kind of information overload, but also trying to figure out then how do these guidelines fit into your particular circumstances in your particular business. There's no super easy answer to that. Some work is going to need to be some work is going to need to go into looking and actually reading these guidances. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC's, as you are probably familiar with now, has some good guidance documents on social distancing, cleaning standards, among others. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, they've had existing extensive regulations and guidance about safety of workers in the workplace. Now, they don't have specific COVID-19 standards like they do their other specific standards, but they've issued guidance documents and industry general guidance documents in particular that talk about how some of the existing requirements and standards might need to be applied in this current environment. And then finally, of course, you don't want to overlook state and local guidance. These vary widely by location. If you are a multi-state employer, then of course you've got potential for different state level guidances as well as all the way down to local level. For CDC's overall guidance, there's a link here on the slides that you'll get later if you want to take a look at that if you haven't already seen it. Many of the things that are in that are, no surprise, things that Susan already identified as the types of things that should be in most plans. Identifying a workplace coordinator that's oversees and administers the COVID-19 plan. Your frequent cleaning and disinfecting of your workspaces, training your employees about how to store and use them, and again, increasing social distance between customers and employees. OSHA's guidance can be both general and industry specific. There's a link here again for where you can check for some industry specific guidelines that apply. And then again, there's some general guidelines for all businesses, which again, no surprise, were covered and incorporated into Susan's presentation quite a bit. But one thing is, in addition to the focus on the COVID-19 kind of things, don't forget your regular OSHA standards that apply, and they can apply not just to, if you're using specific chemicals for cleaning, you may need to have downloaded and available material safety data sheets, things like that. You want to develop these policies and procedures to promptly identify and isolate people, communicate about these, and implement the various workplace controls, whether they're physical barriers, personal protective equipment. And with that, I'll turn it over quickly to Christina Jepson for screening.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about several types of screening that you can do. And really, these are tools that companies can use to try to keep the virus out of their workplace, which, is obviously what we really want to do. As this has spread across the globe, what we've learned is that if you can identify the people who have it, get them care, get them out of workplaces and out of the population, that's the key to keeping this from spreading. So a few things I'm going to talk about are taking temperatures to screen for fever, asking about symptoms, which everyone should be doing, and asking about potential exposure, which I also think everyone should be doing. Now, as you probably know, if you're an HR person, if you've worked with employment sort of issues before, is normally we don't do these kind of things at all. You would never hear an employment lawyer saying you should take people's temperatures, you should ask them about symptoms. Normally, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, we're not allowed to ask those kind of questions at all. But this is a very different time, and now there's kind of a balancing act going on between protecting the public, protecting employees, and still respecting ADA rights. So it's a little bit tricky, and if you're not quite sure how to proceed, you can certainly ask any of us about this topic. But the CDC, the federal government, and the state governments, everyone basically is saying, do not let people into your workplace if they have symptoms. So that's what we're trying to do, is figure out who has symptoms. Next slide. If you are going to take temperatures or screen for symptoms, which you should definitely screen for symptoms at the very least, you should keep a log of the temperatures, or at least the temperatures that are above the threshold, anyone who's reporting positive symptoms, anyone who's reporting positive exposure. And it's really critical that you keep that information completely confidential. This shouldn't be shared with people unless they absolutely need to know it. So you should have a core group of people who are working on this and understand the confidentiality concerns. Like all medical information that's collected in the workplace, it has to be kept in a file separate from their other personnel file. Next slide. It's also important that all of these processes are done in a non-discriminatory way. So while it might seem to make sense to just test people above a certain age, or just screen certain people with certain conditions, you really have to screen everyone. If you're going to do these things, it needs to be applied equally. And for obvious reasons, someone can come into the workplace, be asymptomatic, seemingly well, not have an underlying condition, and yet they could spread the disease. I want to test everyone. Yeah, if you're going to do temperature testing, which I certainly recommend, it's not something probably everyone will do, but something you should consider. You need to set a criteria, and that needs to be in your written policy about your temperature testing. So that criteria is what, above that temperature, no one will be allowed in the workplace. Again, this has to be very consistent. That means if the top manager has a fever, they're not allowed in the workplace, just like anyone else. The minimum temperature should be at least 100.4. If anyone is 100.4 or above, they should not come to work, according to the CDC. You could even go a little bit lower. Some employers are going as low as 100 degrees. Next slide. The one thing that the state of Utah is definitely recommending that people do, and I think you should do, is ask your employees about symptoms, or require them to notify you if they have any of these symptoms. You can do this verbally. You can have them call in before they come to work. You can have them call in just if they have the symptoms. Some companies are using apps or are using online surveys for people to fill out. But it's really a daily check where either people have to report that they have the symptoms or report one way or the other. And these are always changing. They've changed from the beginning of this virus in the U.S. until now. It started with really just cough and shortness of breath and fever. And now you can see at the bottom of this slide, there's more symptoms that the CDC has added to the list. Now, if there's a cough or shortness of breath, either one of those is sufficient to say that person needs to go home and seek medical advice. The ones below that, they have to have at least 2 of those symptoms. And anyone that meets those symptom requirements should not come to work until they're cleared. Next slide. You should also be asking people about exposure in sort of the same kind of way. You could have them call in if they've had exposure before they come to work, or you could do surveys or apps, whatever makes most sense for your company. And we can help you with that if that's something you need. But you're asking them if they've had close contact with someone who has tested positive, if they've tested positive, if they travel to a high-risk area. Again, they should not come to work until they're cleared if that's the case. Now, let's talk a little bit more about temperature testing. There's really kind of 2 ways you can do this. You can either have people do it themselves at home before reporting to work, or you can have them come to work and have it administered by you, the employer, at the workplace. You've got to decide which one makes the most sense for your company. If employees are going to do their own temperatures at home, it's really important that they have good training on what you expect in terms of that temperature taking, that they have access to all the equipment they need, most importantly thermometers, which you need to procure right away, and anything else they need. If they need a computer, if they need access to an app, because you're going to use an app, if they need to have access to the survey, all of those sort of things. And then whatever the procedure is, you need to put that in writing so that everybody understands what the procedure is. Okay, so who will take the temperatures? If people are going to be having their temperatures taken at work, you need to find someone at work who is going to be good at doing that job. If someone has medical training, that would be really terrific. You could put someone in place who already has some of that training, like someone with an EMT license, for example. You could also hire someone to come on site and do the training, or you could just select someone who you think will be good at it and get them up to speed. Whoever's going to do the temperature taking, they need to have masks and other protective equipment, and those having their temperatures taken should also be wearing masks. If you're going to get thermometers and do temperature taking, or any supplies you need for any of these processes, start immediately if you haven't already, because these things are hard to come by. So think about thermometers, cleaning supplies, masks. If you're going to be doing some kind of temperature taking or screening, work where you need cones, things like that, get that as quickly as you can. Some other issues to keep in mind with temperature taking are that you still have to obey by all the CDC rules. So still you have to have social distancing. You can't have a crowd of people coming into work, getting in line together to have their temperature taken. That defeats the purpose. So do it in a way that keeps people distanced, where the equipment is cleaned, where high touch areas are cleaned. Really think about that in advance. If you're going to do it at work, some of the options are you could do it outside the workplace, like in a parking lot outside your doors. That's what the CDC really recommends, so that people aren't coming in and potentially infecting your whole workplace before it's discovered that they have a fever. You could do a drive-through screening process, sort of like they're doing a lot of the COVID testing. You could set up a trailer outside. You could do it inside your facility, but if you do it inside the facility, keep it very close to the front door and don't expose people to the rest of your workers until they've cleared the temperature test. If you have some little separate room you could put in, that would be great. And then, of course, take all the safety precautions in terms of sanity and, sanitizing and cleaning, and sanity. Thank you. And then we have to talk about failure to pass. And that really means that someone either hasn't passed because their temperature was too high, they reported potential symptoms of COVID, or they reported a potential exposure to COVID. And if that's the case, they haven't passed, they need to be sent home or not allowed to come to work in the first place, and they need to have an understanding about what they need to do next and when they'll be allowed to return to work. And you really got to think about this in advance so everyone knows the rules of the game as this happens. Once an employee has been sent home, you need to make sure you're doing follow-up, that they get tested and you find out the results. They get medical advice about whether they need to be tested, whether they're likely infected. And if they are in fact infected, you obviously have to notify people that they have worked with or worked near that there's been potential exposure, while still maintaining the confidentiality of that person. And then you need to have a procedure about when a person can return to work if they've had symptoms or if they've tested positive. And you can see that from this slide that it's a pretty complicated sort of, there is an either or way that a person can be cleared. And I'll let you just kind of read through that, but you want to have that in your policy for sure. Once you've decided what you're going to do in terms of temperature taking, screening for symptoms, you need to put this in a written policy choose someone to run the program, communicate it to employees, train everyone. And I really suggest doing a dry run. That's how you're going to find out what some of the potential issues are, what you're missing in terms of equipment. That would be really helpful. Other issues in terms of legal issues that you should think about is that you have to compensate hourly employees for time screening, and you have to figure out how you're going to deal with people who refuse to be tested or provide answers. Now, the final thing that I'm going to talk about is protecting vulnerable persons. And I really think this is one of those critical pieces of this whole return to work. We really can't successfully return to work in this country if we don't protect the people who are most at risk of getting really ill if they contract COVID. And in fact, if you go forward in the slides, the government has said that it's really important that we protect vulnerable people. Now, this could be both our employees themselves that fall in high-risk groups. It could also be people they live with. If they come to work and they contract it and they go home and they live with a high-risk person, that could also be a problem. So these are older people, people with immunity issues, people with certain underlying conditions. And again, this is a situation where the list of conditions is changing all the time as scientists and healthcare workers are studying this disease and finding out who's really impacted the most. So stay up to speed on that. The federal and state mandates, including the Utah mandate going to orange, says that we need to continue to take extreme caution to protect these vulnerable people. And in fact, Utah says that we should make special accommodations for these people in the workplace if they're unable to work at home. So number one is they should work at home if they can. If you can allow them to work at home, that's what you should do. If not, then you've got to take extra precautions in the workplace to make sure that they are very protected. But again, as I mentioned, there are limits in how you can do this. I mean, you can't just say people who are older, we're just going to fire you, or you're just furloughed, or people with underlying conditions, you can't work or you're furloughed. That would be discrimination. So what do you do? I know sometimes these things are complicated. Lawyers say, well, you can't do this and you can't do this. Well, what can I do? And really what I'm suggesting to clients is a little bit different than we would do in normal times, but that you create policies that really encourage employees to come forward and self-identify if they're in a vulnerable population, either because of their age, because of an underlying condition, maybe someone they live with is very much at risk, and that they then talk to you about the accommodations they want. You can't ask somebody about that. You can't force them to tell you, but they can certainly self-identify, and you should encourage that. And then if they do, of course, identify, then you need to ask them about what sort of accommodations they need, and then think about all the things you could do to help them, whether it's sort of taking them out of positions where they have a lot of contact with other people or with customers. If it's teleworking, extra cleaning, maybe you get them the N95 masks, even though other employees are just going to be wearing cloth masks. Those are the sort of things you need to consider. So like I mentioned, employees should be able to self-disclose disabilities or underlying conditions and vulnerabilities, and we just need to do everything we can to try to accommodate those people. Now, finally, I just want to talk about what if an employee refuses to work. And there's really two different ways this could come up. A person could refuse to work because they have one of these vulnerabilities and they really are concerned about the workplace. And that's one situation. And you really want to proceed cautiously and make sure you're talking to people about why they don't want to work. And, keep your ears open for a possible condition that they might have that makes them at risk that you need to then talk to them about accommodation. If, on the other hand, it really just comes down to someone being scared, they don't have a special situation, then, they really can't refuse to work if they want to stay employed. I wouldn't, again, I would suggest you talk to your legal counsel before you, decide how to proceed, but that is kind of the bottom line. Okay, that's all I have on that. Thank you.
Christina, thank you so much. We've had a couple of questions come in. I think we have just a quick second to address these. Okay. One is a really hard question, and one I think is easier. Which would you like first?
Given whatever you want to do, either order.
Well, let's start with the hard one.
Okay.
Where can I find a good thermometer?
Yeah, that is a super hard one. I ordered one a couple months ago. It arrived Friday. I put batteries in it, and it immediately started burning up and smoking. So I don't know if I'm the best person to tell you that. There is a program that the Utah government started yesterday, where they're providing a basic starter package of PPE to small businesses. So you should look into that if you qualify potentially as a small business. They have some supplies that they can give you. Other than that, I would check with your industry groups and see if they have any information. If you belong to a restaurant association or retailer association or manufacturing association, sometimes they have some resources to help you find equipment.
Thank you, Christina. And the next question is, can I enforce an employee to download the Healthy Together app, or any app for that matter?
Yeah, I don't know if we have completely clear guidance on this. I would be curious what my colleagues think about that. I think you probably can. You probably can't make them use the parts of the app that track all their everything they do in terms of walking around, but at least the part of the app that requires them to answer the questions about potential symptoms, I don't see any problem with that. It's just another way of using that, asking those questions. If someone really has a problem with the app, I would ask them why, try to find out what their concern is. Maybe you could ask them to use another method for answering the questions. Does anyone else have any thoughts about whether you can make people use a particular app? Susan or Mark?
Yeah, I think not so much the particular app that you're talking about, but like the one I mentioned that has the ability to tell when you're close to somebody else in the workplace. I think definitely that you can. It addresses only behavior in the workplace. It only tracks you there. But I agree with you in terms of less than clear guidance on the ones that have additional privacy issues or track behavior outside the workplace.
I have the Healthy Together app. You have the option of allowing it to sort of track all of your movement or not. So you can use it in different ways. You can just answer the questions. You can use it to track you. Some people are fine with that. Some people have more privacy concerns. So I hate to say it's not completely clear, but there's certainly a line between you have more freedom as an employer to tell employees to do certain things in the workplace. What they do outside of the workplace, I think you have less ability to control that.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Christina, for the practical guidance. For our last segment, we'll turn the time over to Mark Wagner. Mark? And Mark, you're on mute.
Got it. Yep. No, just was looking for the little mute button. So occasionally I lose that. So we're going to talk quickly about personal protective equipment, primarily what we're all seeing in the workplace right now. We're seeing outside. Face coverings are certainly the type of equipment that has gotten the most attention. Something that you might be surprised to learn, certainly I was when I first learned it, is that OSHA does not consider all types of masks the same. Primarily, there are some things that they may refer to really as masks, but face coverings, and they differentiate largely based on whether or not the mask or the face covering is intended to filter or not filter out outside air. Most of what we're seeing right now that you probably see in grocery stores or with employees at restaurants are generally these loose-fitting masks, even surgical masks like you see in this picture here. And when I say they're not intended to filter air, that is illustrated by the fact that you can see a little bit of a gap around the cheek area, around the nose area. Those areas will allow air in as you're breathing, and so it's not something that's going to protect you from the virus. That's again more likely to protect other people if you happen to have the virus and you're asymptomatic or something like that. Now these are subject to OSHA has a PPE or personal protective equipment standard, and I'll touch on it very briefly, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it because we just don't have the time here. But just wanted to make you aware of the issue. Next slide. Okay, now we come to what are referred to as respirators. Again, the idea being these filter the air. The most common one that we hear a lot about is the N95 masks and those and then above. N95 masks filter out 95% of particles down to, I think it's 0.3 nanometers. It's incredibly small. And there's some differences. You can see these are designed to fit much more tightly around someone's face. The elastic bands, they're wider. The elastic bands hold them firmly against the face. You have a moldable piece of metal up towards the top above the bridge of the nose. There's usually foam underneath the mask there. You mold that to your particular face shape, and then you put your hands on it, you blow out, make sure that there's no air escaping in any of these particular areas, because if it does, then it doesn't do you any good. There's other equipment that goes up above that, N99, N100, powered air purifying, self-contained breathing apparatuses, etc. Now these are subject to both OSHA's PPE, personal protective equipment standard, and to a much more extensive OSHA respiratory protection standard. And again, I'll just make you aware of them generally, but just don't have time to go into much detail. So what does all that mean? I mean, what is it that you should require or at least permit? Whether you should require something or not and permit it, and then specifically what. Of course, you want to check your local jurisdiction directives and orders to see if they have a particular requirement, whether it's face coverings in general or whether they actually specify a specific type. And if it's required, use what's required, but keep in mind the differences between the two types of general categories of equipment, and that you comply with the appropriate OSHA standards. We can help you with that if you're not already familiar with them. The Utah Leads Together 2.0 plan states that employers should provide face coverings when social distancing isn't feasible, and particularly restaurants, manufacturing, close quarters, etc. What is should the same thing as must. Well, and what are we talking about specifically? Face coverings, probably less than the N95 masks. But if it's not clearly specified in a local directive or order, then you want to follow general OSHA guidelines. OSHA has this occupational risk pyramid for COVID-19, and the size roughly corresponds with what they are kind of trying to illustrate as most businesses will be in the lower risk, somewhat less in the medium, and then you get to the high and very high. Next slide. Very high risk and high risk are both alike in this first part of it. That's employees who work closely with, meaning within 6 feet of, patients that are known to be or suspected of being infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And that's the high risk. And on top of that very high risk is if you're also performing specific medical post-mortem laboratory procedures that involve things like getting the potential virus out airborne. These people should be required to wear respirators, and there may very likely be additional personal protective equipment that is also going to apply and be required. Employees at those same businesses who are not going to work closely with these exposed to the same level should be required probably to wear at least face masks and other appropriate personal protective equipment. They should at least be allowed to wear respirators if they desire to, and I'll touch on that in just 1 minute too, because there's a difference. Medium risk, that's workers that are coming in frequent contact with the general public, particularly in areas where you have low to medium or potentially higher community transmission. And depending on what that risk of exposure in your locality and your particular circumstances are, your business configuration, et cetera, type of business, physical space, they should be potentially required and certainly allowed to wear face masks, and again, potentially other personal protective equipment. A low risk, these are generally people who don't have frequent contact with the general public. If you're an office worker and you have appropriate physical distancing, face masks are not, even the basic face masks generally are not required under the OSHA guidance, but they should be allowed at least. So again, caveats, also check your industry guidelines and best practices if applicable, because you may have an industry group that has looked at these issues and tried to fine tune them to your industry and may give you a jump start. And then keep in mind that some leeway might need to be given for ADA reasonable accommodation issues like medical restrictions, or for religious accommodations, religious garb issues, and then those should be analyzed under those paradigms. Now, I mentioned before that there's a difference between voluntary versus required. Now, first of all, if something is required under the OSHA guidance or a guideline, well, then it's required. Do it and then follow the appropriate standard. And that's where, when personal protective equipment is required, then you have to follow that PPE standard, which will be addressed in a slide, a couple slides in, which I'm not going to touch on other than just most briefly. But however, if the personal protective equipment is voluntary, then there are no additional requirements on the employer, even if the employer is the one that pays for or provides the masks. But you should make it clear to your employees, preferably in writing, again, documentation that the masks aren't required and wearing one is voluntary. Then respirators. If they're required, you're going to need to meet the OSHA Respiratory Protection Standard, again, much more comprehensive one. If respirators are voluntary, and this is even if the employer is paying for them and providing them, but not requiring them, then it's a much more lenient standard. You only need to meet what are voluntary use requirements that are in the Respiratory Protection Standard, and those are fairly simple. Basically, you got to make sure that the respirators don't cause their own risk, like snagging on equipment that drags your face into a machine. You got to give them basic equipment information, employees basic information in a way that they can understand it. And you have to make sure that the masks that are used are clean and in good repair. The OSHA PPE standard, as I said, I'm not going to go over this, but you can look at it in the slides. This is just kind of a quick general outline of what it is. And then the OSHA Respiratory Protection Standard. When I said this one is much more comprehensive, this includes being administered by a suitably trained program administrator. You have to have elements in it that are much more onerous, such as, what are your procedures for selecting the right type of respirators, and it's documented as to what and why. There are certain medical evaluations of employees that are required to wear the respirators that need to be conducted to make sure that they're effective for them, and also not, for example, filtering out too much oxygen or something like that for them. Fit testing procedures and use of the procedures for the proper use of the respirators, both in routine and reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. And then we've got a couple on the next slide. And basically, again, procedures and schedules for cleaning, disinfecting, storing, training employees, and then going back periodically and regularly evaluating the effectiveness of the program, tweaking it as need be. And from there, let's go to the next slide. We'll talk briefly about testing, isolating, and contact tracing. So, what can we request that our employees do in order to let them return back into work? Now, EEOC issued a guidance just not quite 2 weeks ago where they made clear that an individual with the virus will pose a direct threat to the health of others. We've been giving that guidance to our clients before this guidance document came out, but it's nice to see that clarification and confirmation, certainly. So you can, in this circumstance, require testing, as Christina talked about, before employees return to work. Now, there's the screening, the temperature testing, but you can also require actual COVID-19 testing if those medical tests, if they're available. They generally need to be job-related because it's with business necessity. But again, in this instance, we've got this direct threat. So where you have this direct threat, it should be done. The takeaway here, too, is that a failure to test under these circumstances might be argued to be negligence at some point. Now, if the Utah statute doesn't stand up, or if you're operating in a jurisdiction that doesn't have a similar statute, that could be very important. Because in saying the EEOC guidance saying that individuals with the virus will pose a direct threat to the health of others, and along with OSHA has a general duty safety clause that you're required to keep a safe workplace for other people. You combine those two together, it suggests that if you're at least a medium risk company and you don't do this testing, it might be argued to be negligence. So it's just a consideration to keep in mind. Next slide. The testing considerations, of course, you're supposed to ensure that the tests are accurate and reliable. You're supposed, and then the EEOC guidance says that employers may want to consider factors such as, particular tests, false positives, false negatives. I wouldn't get too hung up on trying to figure out yourself analyze what's the very best type of testing or what's accurate and reliable. Look to your FDA guidance particularly, and if CDC guidance comes out too on that, but it'll probably primarily be FDA guidance on that. But there may also be some local health authority guidelines, et cetera. Now, remember, this is not a replacement for other measures like social distancing, cleaning, good hygiene in the workplace, et cetera, because actually, there's one fundamental reality of these tests, even aside from the issues of the potential concerns of false positives and false negatives, is that these tests are really just a snapshot of one person at one point in time. So that person, assuming it's not a false positive, that tests negative for COVID-19, meant that when they were at that testing station, they did not meet the criteria for a detection of an infection of COVID-19. That, of course, doesn't mean that they didn't contract it on the way back from the testing facility to your work. So you can't, just rely solely on that. You need to still keep in place the social distancing, your other procedures and barriers, et cetera, other controls that you put in place or should be putting in place. And make sure that you compensate your hourly employees for any time spent on testing. And under Utah law, you need to pay for the test itself. So when an employee tests positive, you should assume pending test results, first of all, that the employees tested are positive. At least you don't have confirmation yet that they're not. But again, that's just a safe way to go. When someone does test positive, be human, empathize. They're going to be concerned not just about their work. They're going to be concerned about what happens next to them. Empathize from a distance and safely. But you want to isolate these employees. You need to send them home for 14 days or until CDC guidance says they're safe to return to work. And I say that primarily, if you have an employee who hasn't tested positive but has reported a potential exposure. 14 days is kind of the time frame that we've talked about because that's the average time frame it takes for someone to become symptomatic, the potential dormancy period for the virus, or at least the symptomatic period. But it's also possible that someone who actually has COVID-19 might be safe to return to work even before someone is just exposed, because the average recovery time is less on average, around 9 days or something like that. But there are guidelines about CDCS specific guidelines about when, what type of factors, how long you should wait. You know, at least 3 days, 72 hours have passed since recovery, meaning resolution of your fever without any sort of fever-reducing medications, and improvement in your respiratory symptoms, and then at least 7 days have occurred, have elapsed since your symptoms first appeared. You need to and assure the employee that you're not going to reveal their identity in the workplace. Keep it as confidential as you can. You want to consider, as part of the plan that Susan was talking about before, too, in the testing considerations portion, is, you know, do you have a plan to quickly test all employees if necessary, if you've learned that, you know, one or substantial number have tested positive? Are you already working remotely? What is your risk exposure here? Have a whole group of all your employees potentially been exposed? Have you mitigated the risk somewhat by other measures like staggered shifts, et cetera? Decide whether or not you need to close for more intensive cleaning, et cetera. Let's see, then, okay, legal considerations. You might want to see to what extent it's possible to determine the employee, where the employee contracted the virus. If it's known, does the employee ask the employee, you know, where have they been? What have they been doing? Who they've been exposed to? This is going to be difficult, and in most instances, it's probably unlikely that that it's going to be determinable where they encountered the virus. But if it was at work, then check with your, well, for applicable states, workers' compensation law, of course, at Utah's Workers' Compensation Act. You notify your workers' comp carrier in that instance if that's determined, and this is also an OSHA log recordable event. Then you want to consider if the employee is eligible for sick leave benefits under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or do they have other accrued leave? And this will depend a lot on, you know, given the size of your company, below 500 employees or above, are the threshold cutoffs for whether the FFCRA applies to you or not. Consider whether or not your short-term disability policy might apply. Then you're going to want to, after you've, you know, isolated and sent home the individual in question, you want to try to identify the other people that person may have come in contact with, 6 feet or less, and particularly for any more than minimal amount of time. Execute a plan for testing the employees, and well, actually, maybe a little out of order here, the contact tracing plan. Again, the sign-in, sign-out policy. What shared workspaces did the person work with? Who does that person recall having been around? Who do other people recall that person having been around? Notify other employees that were exposed, advise them to quarantine and get tested. You need to treat them essentially as if they were exposed, and that includes sending them home for 14 days. Notify them, if at all possible. Think about how you're doing this so that you're identifying them with the fact of a potential exposure, but in a way that's less likely to identify the personal identity of the person who did it. Engage local authorities. There might be public health reporting requirements. There might not be. This is, again, an evolving type of thing. And you want to establish rules for returning to work. Ideally, you'll have a policy on this that says when someone can return to work and who they should consult with for questions. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sean. Sorry, Jason.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark. And I know that we've provided all of you with a lot of information today. As we mentioned at the beginning of the call, today's webinar has been recorded. It will be shared with you along with a copy of our slide deck. So you'll have all of that information at your fingertips. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for Q&A, but I would like to extend a huge thanks to Lindsay Ford and the Park City Chamber of Commerce and Visitors and Convention Bureau for partnering with us on today's presentation. I want to extend a big thanks to my team, Christina Jepson, Susan Mottschedler, and Mark Wagner for staying on top of all the issues that are associated with COVID-19 as it relates to reopening your business. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today and participating in today's webinar. We are here to assist. We're here to help you navigate through these complicated issues. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or if there's anything that we can do to help you get back into a mode of operation that is complying with both practical and legal guidelines. Here is the presenter contact information for all of you. And again, this will be shared with you. So thanks again for joining us. Excuse me, Lindsay, do you have any final comments before we close out? And Lindsay, you're on mute.
Hey, sorry about that. Thank you guys again. That was super informative. We know things are constantly changing, so all the folks that are participating in this webinar, please don't hesitate to reach out to them if you have questions. Obviously, as you heard, they are super knowledgeable. So just thank you, everyone. Hope everyone's staying safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Thanks,
everybody.
Good afternoon.